On a spring morning in 1899, William Earl Dodge Stokes stood on Broadway and 73rd Street, staring at 17 stories of raw limestone rising from the mud. His Ansonia apartments would be the tallest residential building in the world, a self-sustaining paradise with a rooftop farm, soundproof walls, and live seals swimming in the lobby fountain. But what Stokes built that day would become something far stranger than any utopia he imagined. Within a decade, his temple to clean living would house the city's wildest parties, its most scandalous affairs, and a basement bathhouse where the rules of conventional society simply ceased to exist. Chapter 1: The Heir Who Refused His Fortune. William Stokes inherited $20 million and spent his entire life trying to prove he deserved none of it. That the money arrived when he was 21 dropped into his lap like original sin. His grandfather, Anson Phelps Dodge, had made the fortune in copper and cotton, building an empire while William was still learning to walk. By the time young Stokes came of age in 1877, the interest alone generated more wealth than most men saw in lifetimes. He never worked for a dollar. He never had to. And it tortured him. Stokes became obsessed with moral living, with the idea that luxury corroded the soul. He lectured workers on the dignity of labor, while servants pressed his shirts. He funded temperance societies while living in a Fifth Avenue mansion. He married Rita Hernandez, a beautiful Cuban showgirl, then spent years telling her that the theater was a corrupting influence. The contradictions ate at him, turned him rigid and strange. His friends from Yale called him pious. His business associates called him insufferable. His wife called him worse than that, usually through her lawyer. But Stokes believed he had diagnosed the central disease of his age, that wealth concentrated in cities was destroying the American character, that urban living bred vice, that the poor were corrupted by proximity to the rich, and the rich were softened by access to pleasure. He read Jacob Riis and felt vindicated. He walked through the Lower East Side tenements and saw proof of his theory everywhere. Too many people stacked too close together, breathing each other's air, sharing each other's diseases, learning each other's sins. The city was a moral furnace that melted away virtue. What America needed, Stokes decided, was a new kind of building, not a tenement, not a mansion, something unprecedented. An apartment house where families could live in vertical harmony, insulated from urban corruption, but close enough to benefit from civilized society. A place where thick walls prevented the transmission of immoral influence, where residents grew their own food and generated their own power, where every design choice enforced virtue without requiring constant vigilance. If environment determined character, as Stokes believed with religious fervor, then the right environment could save souls. He bought the plot at Broadway and 73rd Street in 1897. 2 full city blocks. Prime real estate in a neighborhood still rough around the edges, but poised for transformation. He hired Paul Dubois, a French architect who had worked on the Exposition Universelle, and gave him instructions that bordered on mania. Make the walls thick enough to contain scandal. Build a rooftop farm so residents never tasted corrupted food. Install pneumatic tubes so servants couldn't steal or snoop. Create a fountain in the lobby, something beautiful and innocent, perhaps with live seals to remind tenants of nature's purity. Design every apartment so families could live self-sufficiently, needing nothing from the morally bankrupt city beyond their doors. Dubois listened and nodded and drew up plans for the most elaborate apartment building ever conceived. 17 stories of Beaux-Arts limestone, turrets and balconies and ironwork that looked like frozen music. Walls 3 feet thick in places. A power plant in the basement. A farm on the roof. And between them, I'd 450 apartments ranging from 3 rooms to 14. Stokes stood at the construction site almost daily, watching the limestone rise, watching his vision take physical form, watching the future. He named it the Ansonia after his grandfather's hometown in Connecticut, a tribute and a promise. This building would embody everything his inherited fortune should represent: stability, independence, moral clarity. It would prove that wealth, properly channeled, could create paradise instead of decay. The irony that would destroy him was already built into the blueprints. He just couldn't see it yet. Chapter 2. The geometry of perfect living. Stokes designed every inch of the Ansonia to make vice architecturally impossible, and he failed spectacularly. The walls came first. 3 feet of brick and concrete and deadening material that made the Ansonia the quietest building in New York. Stokes insisted on the thickness, convinced that noise was how immorality spread between families. If a husband and wife argued, neighbors shouldn't hear. If a tenant hosted questionable company, the sounds shouldn't travel. Privacy would protect virtue. He didn't consider that perfect privacy might enable perfect freedom. The rooftop farm covered 16,000 square feet. Chickens wandered between vegetable plots. Ducks paddled in small ponds. A full-time farmer lived in a cottage up there, tending crops that would feed residents without their needing to trust outside suppliers. Stokes had read too many exposés about contaminated milk and rotten meat sold to the poor. His tenants would eat food grown in clean air. It's above the corruption. The farm cost a fortune to maintain. It produced a fraction of what the building needed. But Stokes didn't care about efficiency. He cared about the principle. The pneumatic tube system ran through every wall, allowing messages and small packages to shoot between apartments and the front desk without human handling. Stokes believed servants were the primary vector for gossip and theft. If you eliminated their access to private information, you eliminated the risk of moral contamination. Tenants could communicate in sealed tubes, their business remaining their own. What he created was an infrastructure for secrets. The lobby fountain became the building's centerpiece, marble and bronze, with water cascading over stone seals that Stokes imported live from Atlantic City. He paid a trainer to keep them healthy and performing. Children came from blocks away to watch them swim and bark and balance balls on their noses. The seals were innocent, playful, everything Stokes wanted his building to represent. They died within a year. The chlorine in the fountain water poisoned them slowly. Stokes replaced them with mechanical versions, bronze statues that looked alive from a distance but didn't move. The illusion of nature without the mess of actual life. Every apartment had its own kitchen, its own bathroom, its own independent systems. No shared facilities meant no forced interaction between classes. The wealthy could live on upper floors without encountering the less prosperous below. Everyone self-sufficient, everyone separate, everyone theoretically safe from each other's influence. The electrical plant in the basement generated enough power for 500 telephone lines, 3,000 electric lights, and dozens of private call buttons that connected apartments to service areas. The Ansonia was a self-contained city, needing nothing from the grid beyond its walls. Stokes installed the first central air cooling system in any residential building. Blocks of ice in the basement, fans pushing chilled air through ducts to every room. In summer, when the rest of New York sweltered, Ansonia residents lived in artificial comfort, another layer of insulation from the city's harsh realities. The soundproofing was the masterpiece. Engineers tested it repeatedly, setting off firecrackers in one apartment while listening in the next. Nothing. You could scream and your neighbor wouldn't hear, and you could throw a party and the family below would sleep undisturbed. Stokes saw only the moral benefit. Privacy meant discretion, meant virtue. He never imagined what people would do with rooms where no one could hear them. The building took 4 years to complete. It cost $4 million, double the original budget. Stokes didn't flinch. You couldn't put a price on creating the blueprint for righteous urban living. The Ansonia would prove that architecture could save souls, that the right walls could keep corruption out and goodness in. On every blueprint, in every specification, the building waited, not to enforce Stokes's vision, but to outlast it. Chapter 3. When Paradise opened its doors. Opening day brought 500 guests, 2,000 roses, and the first cracks in Stokes's perfect world. The Ansonia welcomed its first tenants in January of 1904. Stokes hosted a reception that filled the lobby with Manhattan society. Flowers everywhere, the bronze seals gleaming, a string quartet playing Brahms in the corner, while guests examined the marble staircases and the wrought iron elevators and the pneumatic tube stations with appropriate wonder. The newspapers called it the finest apartment house in the world. Architecture critics praised the Beaux-Arts details, the engineering innovations, the sheer ambition of creating urban self-sufficiency. Society columnists noted which families had secured leases, bankers and lawyers and doctors, respectable people who appreciated what Stokes had built. The building filled quickly, 450 apartments, all leased within 6 months. The rent was steep, but not outrageous, $50 monthly for a small 3-room unit, up to $300 for the palatial 14-room suites on the upper floors. Middle-class professionals mixed with the wealthy, exactly as Stokes intended. Vertical integration of society, kept harmonious by thoughtful design. For a year, maybe 2, it worked precisely as planned. Families loved the quietness. Children played in hallways without disturbing anyone. Couples argued without embarrassment. The thick walls delivered the privacy everyone craved. Tenants praised the modern conveniences, the reliable electricity, the cool air in summer, the rooftop where children could visit the chickens and ducks. Stokes received letters of gratitude, testimonials about how the Ansonia's atmosphere promoted domestic tranquility. Exactly what he wanted to hear. But the building was already selecting its own future. The soundproof walls attracted musicians first. A violinist discovered she could practice at 3 in the morning without complaints. A vocal coach found he could give lessons at any hour, his students belting arias while neighbors slept peacefully. Word spread through New York's artistic community. The Ansonia was different. You could make noise. You could live at odd hours. The building didn't judge. Opera singers started leasing apartments, then theater actors, then composers who worked through the night. The building's population shifted, tilting away from Stokes's vision of quiet domesticity towards something more volatile. Enrico Caruso moved in during 1905, the greatest tenor in the world, choosing the Ansonia specifically for its soundproofing. He rehearsed until dawn, his voice shaking the walls of his own apartment, but never disturbing the banker sleeping next door. Other Metropolitan Opera stars followed. Lily Pons, Lauritz Melchior, Ezio Pinza. The Ansonia became known as the Opera House, though Stokes had built it as the anti-opera house. a refuge from theatrical corruption. The artists loved the building differently than Stokes intended. They loved it because it asked nothing from them. No judgment, no rules about proper hours, no complaints from scandalized neighbors. The thick walls meant freedom, not virtue. Stokes noticed the change but didn't recognize it as transformation. He saw cultured people, respected professionals. Opera singers were artists, after all, not criminals. If they kept strange hours, well, that was the nature of their work. The building was still serving its purpose. He didn't see that purpose shifting under his feet. The first small scandal came in 1907. A banker's wife, name kept from the papers, discovered having an affair with a tenor from the Met. The story made the gossip columns not because affairs were unusual, but because the couple had apparently been meeting for months in his Ansonia apartment without anyone noticing. The building's discretion was perfect. Too perfect. Stokes dismissed it as an aberration. Every building had a scandal eventually. That's what happened when you put 450 families in one place. But the building was teaching its residents something dangerous. It was teaching them that inside its walls, consequences could be delayed, that privacy could be absolute, in that the rules that governed the rest of New York didn't necessarily apply at the Ansonia. The transformation was patient. It didn't announce itself. It waited, accumulating residents who valued discretion over virtue, privacy over propriety. The building filled with people who needed thick walls for reasons Stokes never imagined when he specified the blueprints. By 1910, the Ansonia was already becoming something else, something its creator couldn't control. The building had learned to attract exactly the people it wanted, and it wanted everyone Stokes had tried to keep out. Chapter 4. The Residents Who Rewrote the Rules. The Ansonia attracted exactly the people Stokes wanted to exclude: opera singers, actors, and anyone who lived after dark. Florenz Ziegfeld moved into the Ansonia in 1912, and he moved in like an occupying army. The impresario of the Ziegfeld Follies, the man who defined Broadway glamour, took a 14-room suite on the 10th floor and transformed it into something between a salon and a circus. The apartment was always full. Showgirls and comedians and musicians and writers and hangers-on who came for the party and stayed until dawn. The parties at Ziegfeld's place became legendary. They started after his shows closed, around midnight, and ran until morning. Champagne and jazz and beautiful people doing things that would have horrified Stokes. But the walls absorbed every sound, every sin, every moment of excess. The family sleeping 20 feet away in the next apartment heard nothing, knew nothing. That was the revelation. You could live any way you wanted at the Ansonia. And the building would protect your secrets. Babe Ruth leased an apartment in 1921. The greatest baseball player in America, fresh off hitting 59 home runs, chose the Ansonia because he'd heard what it offered: privacy, space to entertain. No questions asked. His suite became notorious among sports writers, a place where rules bent and teammates came to drink bootleg liquor, and the Sultan of SWAT lived like royalty. Ruth threw parties that made Ziegfeld's look restrained. All-night affairs fueled by illegal alcohol, attended by chorus girls and gamblers, and anyone lucky enough to get an invitation. The noise inside his apartment must have been tremendous. But the neighbors heard nothing. The building kept its secrets. More baseball players followed. Dodgers and Yankees and visiting teams, and all staying at the Ansonia because it was the one place in New York where athletes could misbehave without immediate consequences. The hotel rooms in Midtown had thin walls and nosy staff. The Ansonia had 3-foot walls and a culture of studied indifference. Theodore Dreiser, the novelist, took an apartment on the 7th floor. He was working on An American Tragedy, writing about moral decay and the corruption of ambition, and living in a building that embodied every theme he was exploring. He loved the Ansonia's contradictions: bohar elegance housing bohemian chaos, wealthy bankers sharing elevators with starving artists, the respectable facade hiding whatever people wanted to hide. Dreiser threw smaller parties, more intellectual, but equally subversive. Writers and radicals discussing socialism and free love, while the banker 3 apartments down was reading his evening newspaper, oblivious. The building collected eccentrics. A mystic who claimed to communicate with the dead. A former actress who kept 12 cats in a 3-room apartment and fed them from pneumatic tubes. A composer who only worked during thunderstorms, believing lightning inspired creativity. The Ansonia welcomed them all, charged them rent, and asked no questions. Stokes watched this transformation with growing alarm. His utopia was filling with exactly the theatrical element he'd built it to exclude. He tried imposing rules, lease clauses about quiet hours and appropriate behavior and limits on guests. But the building's design defeated enforcement. How could you prove someone was throwing wild parties when the walls were soundproof? How could you demonstrate moral corruption when everything happened behind closed doors? The manager he hired kept reporting back. Technically, no one was breaking any rules. Rent was paid. Property wasn't damaged. Noise complaints were non-existent because the soundproofing worked perfectly. If residents were living scandalously, they were doing it quietly. The pneumatic tubes became a network for invitations to parties that officially didn't exist. You'd receive a note in your apartment. 10C, midnight, bring friends. And if you went, you'd find a suite full of people living the kind of life that would get you arrested if you tried it on a public street. But this wasn't a public street. This was the Ansonia, where the walls were thick and judgment couldn't penetrate. By 1920, the building's reputation was established. It was where you lived if you had something to hide, or something to celebrate, or simply refused to live conventionally. Young couples who couldn't marry publicly kept apartments there. Artists who needed space to work at odd hours. People whose lives didn't fit the rigid categories of respectable society. The Ansonia became New York's first truly permissive space, not through policy, but through architecture. Stokes had built a fortress against urban corruption. What he'd actually created was a fortress for urban freedom. Walls thick enough that the outside world couldn't reach in, and the inside world couldn't leak out. The building filled with life he never intended. Jazz playing at 3 a.m., affairs conducted across pneumatic tubes, parties that lasted until dawn and left no evidence by breakfast. The Ansonia was learning what it wanted to be, and what it wanted was everything Stokes had tried to prevent. The residents rewrote the rules by ignoring them entirely. They turned his instruments of virtue into tools of liberation. The thick walls meant privacy, yes, but privacy from judgment, not privacy for moral living. The self-contained apartments meant independence, yes, but independence from convention, not independence from vice. Stokes's geometry of perfect living had become the geometry of perfect freedom. The building didn't care about the difference. It just kept standing, solid and soundproof and increasingly notorious, while its creator watched his dream transform into something he could barely recognize. And the Ansonia was alive. It was choosing its own future, and its future looked nothing like the blueprints. Chapter 5. The Bathhouse That Changed Everything. In 1912, a Turkish bath opened in the Ansonia's basement, and the building's transformation accelerated beyond recognition. The continental baths started respectably enough. Morris Wilzig, a businessman with an eye for opportunity, leased basement space from the building's management and opened a traditional bathhouse. Steam rooms and massage tables and cold plunge pools, all finished in white tile and gleaming chrome. It was marketed to the building's wealthier tenants, a European-style spa where you could relax after a day navigating Manhattan's stress. At first, it operated exactly as advertised. Businessmen came down after work, soaked in hot water. I got rubbed down by professional masseurs, went back upstairs refreshed. Nothing scandalous, nothing unusual. Just another amenity in a building full of amenities. But the continental baths had something no other bathhouse in New York possessed. It was located inside the Ansonia. That meant the 3-foot walls, the soundproofing, the maze of basement corridors that connected to the building's mechanical systems, creating spaces within spaces, rooms that existed off the official floor plans. And most critically, it meant the Ansonia's culture of discretion, the unspoken agreement that whatever happened inside the building stayed inside the building. The Continental evolved gradually. First, it extended hours, staying open past midnight for tenants who kept theatrical schedules. Then it started attracting men from outside the building, in a word spreading through networks that couldn't be mapped. Recommendations passed quietly between people who understood what the place was becoming. By 1915, the Continental Baths was operating in a gray zone, still technically legitimate, still offering massage and steam, but increasingly serving as a meeting place for men who had nowhere else to go. New York in the 1910s offered almost no spaces where gay men could gather safely. Bars were raided, parks were patrolled. Any public expression risked arrest and ruin. But the Ansonia's basement was neither public nor private. It existed in architectural limbo, a commercial space inside a residential building, protected by walls that had been designed to prevent the transmission of judgment. The Continental became one of the city's first true safe havens, not through activism, but through accident of location. The bathhouse expanded. Wilzig leased additional basement rooms, installing more steam baths, more private massage rooms, a lounge area with couches and low lighting. The tile work became more elaborate, more sensual. The staff learned to be selectively blind, to see only what they needed to see. Stokes knew something was wrong. Reports reached him, vague and carefully worded, suggesting the bathhouse was attracting the wrong element. He tried to cancel the lease, but the contract was ironclad, running for 20 years. He tried pressuring Wilzig to change the clientele, but how do you enforce that? The Continental was breaking no laws, at least none that could be proven. The bathhouse thrived precisely because of the Ansonia's design. The thick walls meant total acoustic isolation. What happened in the steam room stayed in the steam room. The labyrinthine basement meant multiple entrances and exits, ways to come and go without being observed. The building's culture of privacy meant tenants didn't ask questions about who was using the bathhouse or why. By 1920, the Continental Baths was an open secret in certain circles. If you were gay and living in New York, you knew about it. If you needed a safe place to meet people like yourself, you went there. The bathhouse had evolved from spa to sanctuary, a space where men could be themselves without fear of immediate consequences. The city's vice squad knew about it too. They conducted occasional raids, usually tipped off by complaints from reform groups. But the raids never found much. The Continental's layout, buried in the Ansonia's basement warren, meant there was always warning before police arrived. Secret exits led to maintenance corridors, to storage rooms, to stairwells that connected to the building's residential floors. Men could vanish before badges were shown. The Ansonia itself was complicit, not through policy, but through architecture. Stokes had designed the building to prevent outside interference, to make residents independent from city services. That independence now protected activities he would have despised. The bathhouse became part of the building's identity. When gay men in other cities heard about New York, they heard about the Continental baths. It was famous in the way illegal things become famous. Everyone knew. Officially, no one acknowledged. The business expanded again in the 1920s. More rooms, better facilities, entertainment added. Piano players in the lounge, informal performances. The Continental was becoming something closer to a nightclub than a bathhouse. But it kept the bathhouse license, the steam rooms and massage tables providing legal cover for everything else happening inside. Wilczek ran the place with careful ambiguity. He never confirmed what the Continental was. He just kept it open, kept it safe, kept it operating in the gray zone that the Ansonia's architecture made possible. The bathhouse's existence changed the building's population further. Gay men started moving into the Ansonia, specifically to be near the Continental, to live in a building where they could walk downstairs and find community instead of danger. The Ansonia was becoming a refuge, its apartments filling with people who needed the protection its walls offered. Boy, Stokes watched this and understood, finally, what he'd built. Not a temple to virtue, a fortress for everyone virtue wouldn't protect. The thick walls he'd specified to prevent immorality had instead created the perfect hiding place for lives that couldn't be lived openly. The Continental baths would operate for 60 more years, outlasting Stokes, outlasting Prohibition, outlasting every attempt to shut it down. It survived because it was part of the Ansonia, and the Ansonia had learned how to protect its own. The building's transformation was complete. What had started as a utopian experiment was now the city's most notorious address, and the bathhouse in the basement was both symptom and cause. The Ansonia didn't judge. It just kept the secrets. Chapter 6. When Stokes realized what he'd built. By 1920, Stokes no longer recognized his creation, and the recognition nearly destroyed him. He was 64 years old, and his life's masterwork had become a monument to everything he despised. The Ansonia appeared in gossip columns now, mentioned with a knowing smirk. The Broadway crowd gathered at the Ansonia last night. Another party in the building that never sleeps. The journalist didn't need to specify what kind of party. Everyone knew what the Ansonia meant. Stokes sat in his Fifth Avenue mansion reading these references and felt his utopia slipping away. He'd spent $4 million building paradise and somehow created the opposite. His building housed drunks and adulterers and theatrical people, and worse. The Continental Baths was operating openly in his basement, barely pretending to be legitimate. The rooftop farm had been converted to a garden because maintaining livestock proved impractical. Even the seals in the fountain were dead. Every design choice he'd made with such certainty had backfired. The thick walls that should have protected virtue instead enabled sin. The pneumatic tubes that should have prevented gossip instead facilitated secret communications. The self-contained apartments that should have promoted moral independence instead created isolated kingdoms where residents lived however they pleased. He tried to regain control, issued new lease requirements, no parties after midnight, no guests staying more than 3 days, no theatrical performances in private apartments. The building's manager accepted the directives and did nothing. How could you enforce quiet hours in a soundproof building? How could you limit guests when the pneumatic tubes let people coordinate without oversight? Stokes threatened evictions. Several tenants laughed at him. Their leases were legal contracts, and they were breaking no specific terms, paying rent on time, maintaining their apartments, causing no documentable damage. The scandals he heard about were hearsay, impossible to prove because the building's design prevented evidence from escaping. He considered selling the Ansonia entirely, walking away from the project that had consumed a decade of his life. But who would buy it? The building's reputation preceded it. Any buyer would need to accept what it had become, and Stokes couldn't bring himself to formally surrender his vision to reality. His marriage to Rita was collapsing simultaneously. She'd filed for divorce in 1914, citing his impossible moralizing and his obsession with a building that mocked everything he believed. The newspapers covered the proceedings with glee. New York loved watching the moralistic millionaire's personal life fall apart, while his architectural sermon on virtue turned into the city's wildest address. The divorce cost Stokes a fortune. Rita's lawyers argued she deserved compensation for years of living with his insufferable righteousness. The judge agreed, awarding her a settlement that made headlines. Stokes paid and retreated further into bitterness. He walked through the Ansonia, sometimes, unannounced, trying to catch evidence of the degeneracy he knew was happening. But the building defeated him every time. The hallways were quiet, the apartments were closed. The residents nodded politely and said nothing. Without the soundproofing, he might have heard parties, arguments, the sounds of people living freely. With it, he heard only silence. The silence was worse than noise would have been. It meant the building was hiding everything from him, its own creator. In 1922, Stokes suffered a stroke, not severe enough to kill him, but debilitating enough to confine him to bed for months. He lay in his mansion while the Ansonia continued without him, throwing its parties, housing its scandals, becoming more itself every day. His financial situation worsened. The Ansonia generated rental income, but maintenance costs for a building that size were enormous. The experimental systems he'd installed all needed constant repair. The power plant, the cooling system, the pneumatic tubes, everything broke down regularly. The building ate money the way it ate his moral vision, relentlessly. He took out loans against the property, then larger loans to pay the first loans. The $20 million inheritance that had tormented him with guilt was disappearing into the maintenance of a building that embodied everything he'd built it to prevent. The final humiliation came in 1925. Babe Ruth threw a party so legendary that even the Ansonia's soundproofing couldn't completely contain it. Something happened, some excess so extreme that guests spilled into the hallways, that noise reached neighboring apartments, that police were called. The details never became public. The Ansonia's discretion held even then. But rumors spread through New York, the wildest night in the wildest building in the city. Stokes heard about it from his lawyers. He was 70 years old, financially strained, physically weak, and his creation was hosting orgies for baseball players. The absurdity of it broke something in him. He'd built a temple and wound up with Babylon. He stopped fighting, stopped issuing directives about proper behavior, stopped caring whether the continental baths was a legitimate business. The building had won. His vision had lost. Architecture, he finally understood, couldn't save souls. It could only create spaces, and people would use those spaces however they needed. Stokes died on May 17, 1926. A stroke, sudden and final. He was 71 years old. The obituaries mentioned his philanthropy, his reform efforts, his contribution to architecture. Most of them mentioned the Ansonia, often with barely concealed irony. Now, the man who built paradise and watched it become something else. The building didn't pause, didn't mourn. It kept standing, kept housing its peculiar population, kept offering the freedom its creator had accidentally engineered into its walls. Stokes had wanted the Ansonia to prove that environment determined character. He'd been right about that. He'd just misunderstood what kind of character his environment would create. The building stood as his legacy and his failure, a monument to the impossibility of controlling human nature through limestone and mortar. The Ansonia would outlive him by decades, growing stranger and more notorious with each passing year. It had only just begun becoming what it would be remembered for. The wildest chapters were still ahead, and William Stokes, buried in a family plot in Connecticut, would be spared from witnessing them. Chapter 7: The Decade When Discretion Died. The 1970s arrived at the Ansonia like a match dropped in kerosene, and everything ignited at once. New York was collapsing financially, spiraling into bankruptcy and chaos. The Upper West Side, once respectable, had become rough. Crime rose, property values fell. Buildings that had housed the wealthy now subdivided into cramped apartments for anyone who could pay rent. The Ansonia, already notorious, became more so simply by virtue of still being there while everything around it deteriorated. The continental baths had been operating in cautious semi-secrecy for 60 years. Then Steve Ostro bought the lease in 1968 and decided to stop pretending. He renovated the entire space, installing a dance floor, a professional sound system, mood lighting. He hired entertainers. He advertised subtly in publications that gay men read. He turned the Continental from a bathhouse that hosted secret gatherings into a nightclub that happened to have steam rooms. The transformation was brazen. The Continental now operated like any Manhattan nightclub. Cover charge, drink minimum, shows on weekends. Except it was exclusively for gay men, and it was inside a bathhouse, and it was located in the Ansonia's basement, where 70 years of soundproofing and architectural discretion had created a space the city couldn't easily touch. Bette Midler got her start there. A young singer with a massive voice and no breaks, she auditioned for Ostro in 1970, and he hired her immediately. She performed at the Continental on weekend nights, singing to crowds of shirtless men in towels, her voice echoing off the tile walls while steam drifted across the dance floor. She called her act Bette Midler and her bathhouse beauties. The gay men who packed the Continental loved her, made her famous through word of mouth before the mainstream knew her name. Barry Manilow accompanied her on piano. Just him and Bette and a couple hundred men dancing and drinking and living openly in a way that was still dangerous everywhere else in the city. The Continental had become something unprecedented, a fully public gay nightclub operating in plain sight, protected by the Ansonia's walls and its 70-year tradition of not asking questions. the shows became legendary. Midler singing Friends and Do You Want to Dance, while the crowd sang along, while couples embraced openly, while the bathhouse stopped being coded and became celebrated. The Continental wasn't hiding anymore. It was announcing itself. Upstairs, Plato's Retreat was opening. Larry Levinson, a former McDonald's manager turned countercultural entrepreneur, leased space on the building's ground floor in 1977 and created America's most famous swing club. A place where couples came to have sex with other couples, where the sexual revolution's most radical promises were kept, where liberation meant exactly what it sounded like. Plato's Retreat operated with the same brazen openness as the Continental. Advertisements in alternative newspapers, a neon sign visible from Broadway, membership cards. The club was legal, barely, at operating as a private social club that happened to have mattresses and dim lighting and rooms designed for group activity. The media discovered it immediately. Film crews showed up wanting to document the phenomenon. Journalists wrote breathless accounts of what they'd witnessed inside. Talk shows hosted debates about whether places like Plato's Retreat represented freedom or moral decay. The club became famous, then infamous, then simply part of New York's cultural landscape. The Ansonia now housed two of the most notorious addresses in American sexual culture. The Continental Baths in the basement, serving gay liberation. Plato's Retreat on the ground floor, serving heterosexual experimentation. Between them, 17 floors of residential apartments where opera singers and artists and families lived, all insulated by the same soundproofing that had protected Scandals since 1904. The building had become exactly what Stokes feared most, a vertical monument to hedonism, its Beaux Arts facade hiding activities that would have horrified its creator. But the Ansonia didn't care. It just stood there, solid and soundproof, containing multitudes. Tourists started arriving deliberately. Bus tours included the Ansonia en routes, guides pointing out the building where Plato's Retreat operated, where Bette Midler sang to bathhouse crowds, where anything was supposedly possible behind those limestone walls. The building's notoriety became part of New York's identity, proof that the city contained spaces where the rules were different. Inside the Continental, the culture reached its apex. Ostrow had created something rare, a place where gay men could be completely themselves without fear. Not just sexually, though that was part of it, but socially, emotionally, publicly. Men held hands walking to the dance floor, kissed openly, introduced their partners using real names instead of codes. The Continental offered a glimpse of what life might be like without hiding. The bathhouse hosted 1,500 members at its peak. Men came from across the country specifically to visit, to experience a night where being gay wasn't dangerous. The Continental charged $10 admission, operated 7 days a week, employed a full staff of bartenders and DJs and cleaning crews who all understood they were maintaining more than a nightclub. They were maintaining sanctuary. Plato's Retreat was less political, but equally radical. Levinson built the club on a simple premise. Consenting adults should be able to explore sexually without judgment. The club offered that space. Couples checked their inhibitions with their clothes, spent hours in an environment where traditional monogamy was temporarily suspended, then went back to their regular lives. At its peak, Plato's serviced 200 guests on weekend nights. The revenue was enormous. Levinson became wealthy, running the city's most shameless business. He appeared on television, defended his club to critics, argued that sexual freedom was American freedom. the Ansonia stood at the center of the sexual revolution's most visible front. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because the building's architecture, designed 70 years earlier to prevent exactly this, turned out to be perfect for enabling it. The thick walls meant privacy. The maze-like layout meant discretion. The culture of not asking questions meant safety. Everything Stokes built to contain virtue had become infrastructure for liberation. The city watched with fascination and horror. Religious groups protested outside. Neighborhood associations demanded the clubs be shut down. Politicians gave speeches about declining moral standards and the need to preserve decency. But the clubs kept operating, protected by the First Amendment, by operating licenses, and most of all, by the Ansonia's essential nature. The building had been containing scandals for 70 years. It knew how to protect what happened inside its walls. The 1970s belonged to the Ansonia in a way no decade had before. It was the building where the future was being tested, where social experiments that terrified mainstream America were playing out nightly. Liberation and excess, freedom and consequence, all compressed into 17 stories of Beau-Art limestone. Stokes's utopia had become the opposite of everything he imagined. And in becoming that opposite, it had achieved a kind of perfection he never anticipated. The building was finally, completely itself. But Chapter 8, The Neighbors Who Couldn't Look Away. By 1975, the Upper West Side watched the Ansonia with equal parts horror and fascination. The building sat at Broadway and 73rd like a limestone scandal, impossible to ignore. Families who'd lived in the neighborhood for generations passed it daily, watching the neon sign for Plato's Retreat glow against Beau-Art elegance, watching the steady stream of people entering the Continental Baths, watching their neighborhood transform around this single, immovable structure. Sarah Feldman lived 3 blocks north on West 76th. She'd raised her children there, watched the neighborhood shift from wealthy to middle class to something harder to define. The Ansonia bothered her, not because of what happened inside, but because of what it represented. A building that refused to acknowledge the rules everyone else followed. She organized neighborhood meetings. 30, sometimes 40 residents gathering in synagogue basements and church halls, discussing what to do about the Ansonia, about Plato's Retreat advertising in The Voice, about tour buses stopping outside so visitors could photograph the building where the sex club operated, about their children asking questions they didn't want to answer. The meetings went nowhere. What could they do? The clubs were legal. The building was privately owned. You couldn't shut down a business because it offended your sensibilities. This was New York. The First Amendment protected even activities you found disgusting. But Feldman kept organizing, kept pressuring politicians, kept documenting every complaint about noise or traffic or public lewdness near the building. She became the Ansonia's most dedicated opponent, spending hours she didn't have fighting a building that had outlasted better connected enemies. Other neighbors had different reactions. Robert Chen, who owned a bookstore on Columbus Avenue, appreciated the Ansonia's presence. It brought foot traffic, tourists who needed coffee or directions or bookstore browsing while they waited for the clubs to open. His business had improved since Plato's Retreat started advertising nationally. The economic benefit was real, but unmentionable. No one wanted to admit they profited from the sex clubs. But restaurants near the Ansonia stayed open later, serving the after-midnight crowd that emerged from the Continental. Taxi drivers knew the address, circled the block hoping to catch fares. The building generated commerce, even if that commerce had a sleazy edge. The cultural collision was sharpest on weekends. Friday and Saturday nights, the Ansonia's entrance became a spectacle. Couples arriving for Plato's retreat, dressed conspicuously despite the club's private nature. Gay men heading to the Continental, now their presence itself a political statement in 1975 New York. Tourists gawking from across the street. Protesters sometimes, holding signs about moral decay. And through it all, Ansonia residents coming and going, treating the circus as background noise. Opera singers heading to performances, artists carrying canvases, families with groceries. The building still housed normal life, alongside its notorious reputation. Rabbi David Katz from the synagogue on West 73rd preached about the Ansonia, using it as a parable about moral decay without naming it directly. Everyone knew what he meant. The building that rejected godly order, that celebrated license over restraint. His sermons attracted overflow crowds, people wanting to hear righteousness defended in an age that seemed to have abandoned it. But some of his congregation attended the Continental quietly. Being gay and Jewish in 1975 meant navigating impossible contradictions. The bathhouse offered something the synagogue couldn't: acceptance without theology. The police watched the Ansonia constantly. Vice squad detectives parked outside, documenting who entered and when, looking for evidence of prostitution or drug sales or anything that might justify a raid. But the clubs operated carefully. No drugs on premises, no prostitution. Just consenting adults doing legal things that happened to be socially unacceptable. Occasionally, the police raided anyway, bursting into the Continental with badges and flashlights, demanding identification from everyone present. The raids never found much. Maybe someone underage with a fake ID. There's maybe code violations in the building's plumbing. Nothing substantial enough to force closure. The raids terrorized the Continental's patrons anyway. Being arrested at a gay bathhouse in 1975 could destroy your life. Men gave fake names, fake addresses, pleaded with officers not to file reports. Most of the time, the police let everyone go after checking IDs. The harassment was the point, the reminder that even in sanctuary, danger was only a raid away. Plato's retreat faced different pressure. The club's heterosexual clientele meant less legal risk, but more moral outrage. Churches organized protests outside, parents holding children while they chanted about decency. The protests were theatrical but pointless. Levinson had his licenses. The club would keep operating. The media circus intensified everything. A film crews camped outside the Ansonia, interviewing protesters and patrons and random neighbors. Television shows about the sexual revolution used the building as visual shorthand for societal change. The Ansonia became famous globally as the place where America's traditional values went to die. Inside, residents tried to maintain normal lives. A violinist practicing in her soundproof apartment while 3 floors below, Plato's retreat operated at capacity. A family eating dinner while tourists photographed their building from the street. The Ansonia had always contained contradictions. Now those contradictions were broadcast internationally. Property values around the building fluctuated wildly. Some buyers avoided the area specifically because of the Ansonia's reputation. Others sought it out, wanting to live near New York's countercultural epicenter. The building polarized even the real estate market. Long-time residents felt the neighborhood slipping away. The Upper West Side had been changing for years, crime rising, middle-class families moving to suburbs. But the Ansonia seemed to accelerate the transformation. its notoriety attracting exactly the elements that made traditionalists uncomfortable. Yet the building endured. Protests came and went. Politicians gave speeches. Religious leaders condemned it. Media coverage cycled from scandal to nostalgia and back. The Ansonia just stood there, containing its secrets, protecting its residents, enabling whatever happened inside its soundproof walls. The neighbors couldn't look away because the building forced them to confront questions they'd rather avoid. What was freedom worth? Who decided what counted as decency? Could architecture undermine morality, or did it just reveal what morality had always struggled to contain? The Ansonia offered no answers. It just kept operating, kept housing contradictions, kept being the building that wouldn't conform to anyone's vision of what it should be. 70 years after Stokes built his utopia, it had become the neighborhood's favorite controversy. A landmark everyone recognized, but few could agree about. The building's greatest trick was outlasting judgment. It was still there when the protesters went home, when the media moved on, when politicians stopped caring. Just standing, solid and soundproof, waiting for whatever came next. Emer Chapter 9, when the city finally intervened. The health crisis that closed Plato's Retreat in 1985 ended more than one business. AIDS appeared in New York around 1981. At first, it was mysterious deaths among gay men, pneumonia that shouldn't kill healthy people, cancers that didn't make sense. Then the pattern became clear. Then the terror set in. Then the dying accelerated beyond anyone's ability to process. The continental baths tried to adapt. Ostro posted safe sex guidelines, provided condoms, encouraged caution. But the bathhouse's entire purpose was intimate contact between strangers. You couldn't make that safe when the mechanism of transmission was still being understood, when fear outpaced medical knowledge, when every sexual encounter carried unknowable risk. Attendance dropped catastrophically. Men who'd visited weekly stopped coming. The dance floor that had been packed with 1,500 people on weekends now served dozens. The Continental was dying, its community scattered by a disease that no one yet knew how to fight. The bathhouse closed in 1985. Not from raids or protests or moral pressure, from irrelevance and terror. The space that had offered sanctuary became associated with death. Ostro shut it down quietly, posted a notice on the door, and walked away from 16 years of providing what had seemed like liberation. The closure devastated what remained of the community. The Continental had been more than a nightclub. It had been proof that gay men could gather openly, that community was possible, that life could be lived without constant hiding. Losing it felt like losing the future that had seemed inevitable just 5 years earlier. Plato's Retreat lasted slightly longer, but faced the same inevitability. The swing club had operated on the promise that sexual freedom carried no consequences beyond pleasure. AIDS demolished that promise. The couples who'd visited regularly stopped coming, afraid of diseases that monogamy might prevent, but promiscuity certainly invited. Levinson tried to keep the club open. He installed stricter health protocols, required HIV testing for members, posted educational materials about transmission. But the fundamental problem was unfixable. You couldn't run a sex club during a plague where sex was the vector. The health department shut Plato's Retreat down in 1985, citing public health emergency. Levinson fought the closure. Eno argued it violated his rights, took the city to court. He lost. The judge ruled that public health superseded private freedom. The club that had symbolized the sexual revolution's victory closed permanently on New Year's Eve, 1985. The Ansonia suddenly went quiet. The basement that had throbbed with music and life and transgression stood empty. The ground floor space sat vacant. 70 years of notorious activity just stopped, not with defiance, but with exhaustion and grief. The building's population changed almost overnight. The gay men who'd moved there to be near the Continental left, seeking neighborhoods where AIDS hadn't destroyed every gathering place. The artists who'd valued the Ansonia's permissive culture found it depressing now, haunted by recent loss. Long-term residents remained. The opera singers and families and eccentrics who'd lived there through every transformation. But the building's essential character shifted. It was no longer the place where the future was being tested. It was a relic of optimism that had ended badly. The neighborhood's attitude toward the Ansonia softened, replaced by something like pity. The building that had been a moral outrage was now just sad, its basement empty, its reputation outdated. The protesters stopped coming. There was nothing left to protest. Inside the Continental's abandoned space, the tile work remained. The steam rooms, the dance floor, the bars and lounges where Bette Midler had sung. All of it sitting dark and unused, waiting for someone to decide what it should become next. The building preserved everything, as it always had, even memories it might prefer to forget. The AIDS crisis transformed the Ansonia from scandal to cautionary tale. People stopped talking about it with smirks and knowing references. The building's libertine history seemed less amusing when thousands were dying from diseases spread in places that had celebrated liberation without considering cost. This wasn't fair. The Continental had been one space among many where AIDS spread, and Plato's retreat wasn't a significant factor at all. But the Ansonia had been so famous as a symbol of sexual freedom that its association with the crisis seemed inevitable in retrospect. The building that had enabled everything now got blamed for consequences it hadn't caused alone. The closure of the bathhouse and the swing club felt like an ending, the final chapter in the Ansonia's long story of transformation from utopia to libertine sanctuary. But buildings outlast their reputations. The Ansonia still stood, still solid, still soundproof, waiting for its next incarnation. The immediate aftermath was just emptiness, vacant commercial space in the basement, declining residential occupancy upstairs. The building that had been New York's most notorious address became just another struggling property on the Upper West Side, competing for tenants in a city that was hemorrhaging population to suburbs and safer places. Developers started circling. The Ansonia occupied prime real estate, 2 full blocks at a major intersection. Its notoriety was a problem, but maybe problems could be solved with enough money and renovations. The building's greatest survival skill was patience. It had outlasted Stokes's moralism. It had outlasted the sexual revolution. It would outlast AIDS, though the cost of that survival was grief the limestone couldn't express. The Ansonia stood quiet for the first time in 80 years, its basement dark, its reputation fading into history. The building waited, as buildings do, for whatever would come next. Chapter 10. The building nobody wanted. For 20 years, the Ansonia decayed while developers circled, unable to decide what it should become. The building after 1985 existed in commercial purgatory, too notorious to attract respectable tenants, too expensive to maintain with vacancy rates climbing, too famous to demolish but too problematic to preserve as it was. The Ansonia needed reinvention, but no one could agree on what form that reinvention should take. Residential occupancy declined steadily. Apartments that had housed opera singers and artists now sat empty, their soundproof walls containing only silence. The few remaining tenants were mostly rent-controlled holdouts, people who'd lived there decades and couldn't be forced out easily. The building felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by its own excessive past. The rooftop farm, abandoned since the 1920s, became a dumping ground for mechanical equipment and broken furniture. The lobby fountain where seals had once swum filled with stagnant water and debris. The pneumatic tube system, unused for years, clogged with decades of accumulated dust. Maintenance costs remained astronomical. The electrical plant needed constant repairs. The cooling system broke down repeatedly. The building's experimental infrastructure, cutting edge in 1904, was now just expensive and obsolete. The ownership consortium that controlled the Ansonia hemorrhaged money trying to keep basic systems functional. Developers proposed demolition. The land was worth more empty than occupied by a decaying apartment building. You could build 2 modern high-rises on the site, sell luxury condos, make a fortune. The Ansonia's notoriety would be erased, replaced by architecture with no inconvenient history. But the building was landmarked in 1972. The Landmarks Preservation Commission had designated it historically significant, protecting the Beaux Arts facade and major architectural features. You couldn't tear it down without navigating years of bureaucratic challenges and public hearings. Most developers decided the hassle exceeded the profit. Other proposals suggested converting the Ansonia to a hotel. The building's scandalous reputation might actually be marketable to tourists. Stay where Babe Ruth threw legendary parties. Sleep where Caruso rehearsed. Visit the former site of Plato's retreat. The Ansonia could become a destination specifically because of its sordid history. These proposals went nowhere. The building's layout didn't work well for a hotel. The apartments were too large, the corridors too labyrinthine. Converting it would require gutting the interior entirely, which the Landmarks designation complicated. And the marketing angle felt distasteful, even by New York standards. Profiting explicitly from W.E.D.'s-era bathhouse history seemed like poor timing in the early 1990s. The building just sat there, slowly deteriorating. Exterior limestone cracked and needed repair. Interior plaster crumbled. The soundproofing that had enabled so much freedom was now just decaying insulation inside walls no one wanted. Every year, the Ansonia became more expensive to maintain and less desirable to occupy. Longtime residents watched their home decline. The elevator system broke down frequently, leaving older tenants stranded on upper floors. The cooling system failed entirely one summer, making apartments unbearable. The management company, overwhelmed by costs and complexity, did minimum necessary maintenance and nothing more. Squatters moved into vacant apartments. The building's maze of corridors and broken security made it easy to occupy units illegally. At one point, estimates suggested 50 people were living in the Ansonia without leases, camping in apartments that still had electricity and water, but no legal tenants. The neighborhood watched the Ansonia decay with mixed feelings. Some residents felt vindicated. The building that had flaunted conventional morality was now suffering its inevitable decline. Others felt sadness. Whatever you thought about its history, the Ansonia was architecturally significant. Letting it rot felt like letting part of New York die. Politicians occasionally made noise about the building's condition. City inspectors documented code violations. Fines were issued and ignored. The ownership consortium didn't have money to fix problems, and forcing bankruptcy would just create a more complicated mess. The Ansonia became a case study in how buildings outlast their usefulness. It had been designed for a world that no longer existed, adapted to purposes its creator never intended, then abandoned when those purposes became associated with tragedy. Now it just stood, too expensive to maintain, too protected to demolish, too notorious to reimagine easily. Urban explorers started sneaking inside. Photographers documented the decay, posting images online of empty hallways and abandoned apartments. The Ansonia's ruin had a melancholy beauty, all that Beaux Arts details slowly crumbling, nature reclaiming the building through broken windows and leaking roofs. The bottom seemed to be in the late 1990s, vacancy rate above 50%, structural problems multiplying, the ownership consortium discussing bankruptcy. The building looked terminal, another piece of old New York that couldn't adapt to the modern economy. But real estate has its own logic. The Upper West Side was gentrifying. Property values were rising. Developers with longer time horizons started reconsidering the Ansonia, seeing potential where others saw only problems. The building waited. It had waited before, during every transition, every transformation. Patience was the only survival skill architecture really had. What saved the Ansonia was the same thing that had cursed it: location. Broadway and 73rd was too valuable to waste on decay. Someone would eventually figure out how to make the building profitable again. They just needed to decide who the Ansonia should be for next. Chapter 11: The Restoration That Erased Nothing. When the Ansonia finally became luxury condos, the developers discovered you cannot renovate away a building's memory. The conversion started in 2000. A development group paid $60 million for the property and announced plans to transform the Ansonia into high-end residential condominiums. They would preserve the Beaux Arts exterior, restore architectural details, and completely gut the interior to create modern luxury apartments. The building would be saved by erasing most of what made it distinctive. The Landmarks Commission approved the plan reluctantly. The exterior would be protected. The lobby's basic structure would remain, but the soundproof walls could be removed. The pneumatic tube system could be demolished. The continental bath space could be converted to fitness facilities and storage. Everything that had enabled the Ansonia's notorious history would be stripped out and replaced with conventional construction. The developers marketed the building carefully, emphasizing the Beaux Arts architecture, the prime location, the historical pedigree, mentioning selectively that opera singers had lived there, avoiding completely any reference to bathhouses or swing clubs or decades of scandalous excess. The Ansonia was being repositioned as elegant, respectable, suitable for wealthy professionals. But the building's memory persisted. During demolition, workers found remnants everywhere. Tile work from the continental baths still intact in basement spaces. Pneumatic tube stations sealed behind walls. Soundproofing material thick enough to stop artillery. The building's bones remembered everything, even when the developers wanted to forget. The renovation took 5 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Every apartment was rebuilt from scratch. The electrical system was modernized. The ancient cooling system was replaced with central air. The building's experimental infrastructure was finally removed, replaced by contemporary mechanical systems that worked reliably without constant maintenance. The lobby was restored to something approximating its original grandeur. The fountain was rebuilt, marble cleaned and polished, bronze work repaired. But the seals didn't return, even as statues. The fountain sat empty, a beautiful architectural feature with no function beyond decoration. The innocent Stokes had tried to capture was gone permanently. Apartments sold well despite the building's complicated history. Or perhaps because of it, some buyers appreciated living in a landmark. Others enjoyed the notoriety, the story they could tell at parties about living where Babe Ruth threw legendary gatherings. The Ansonia's past became a selling point, sanitized and made safe through renovation. Prices ranged from $800,000 for a one-bedroom to $20 million for a penthouse suite. The building that had once housed artists and eccentrics now housed investment bankers and tech entrepreneurs. The demographic transformation was complete, from utopian experiment to libertine sanctuary to luxury real estate. But certain residents understood what they'd bought. Larry Silverstein, the real estate developer who rebuilt the World Trade Center, purchased an apartment in the Ansonia. He appreciated the building's architectural significance and its complicated legacy. Living there meant occupying history, even history that made people uncomfortable. The continental bath space was converted to a fitness center, complete with modern equipment and clean aesthetics. But the basic layout remained. The same rooms where Bette Midler had sung now housed rowing machines and yoga classes. The tile work was gone. The atmosphere completely changed, but the geometry of the space preserved the bathhouse's footprint. Longtime residents from the building's notorious era occasionally returned to see the conversion. Some felt relief that the Ansonia had been saved from demolition. Others felt the renovation had destroyed everything that made the building significant. You can restore architecture, but you can't restore culture, and the Ansonia's culture had been its most important feature. The building's Wikipedia page documents both histories, the Beaux Arts masterpiece and the Libertine sanctuary. Architectural tours mention it as a preservation success story. LGBT history tours mention it as a lost, safe haven. The same building, remembered differently depending on which aspect matters to you. Photographs from the continental baths still circulate online. Bette Midler in the early 70s, performing to crowds of shirtless men in a steamy basement. Those images feel impossibly distant now, separated from the current Ansonia by only decades, but by cultural chasms that make restoration impossible. The building received architectural awards for the conversion. Preservationists praise the careful restoration of Beaux Arts details. Real estate analysts called it a successful adaptive reuse. By conventional measures, the renovation saved the Ansonia. But it also erased the building's most radical achievement. The Ansonia had been a space where conventional rules didn't apply, where architecture accidentally enabled freedom, where people lived outside normal constraints. The renovation returned it to respectability, made it safe for luxury consumption. The soundproof walls were mostly gone, replaced by modern construction that met code but didn't offer the same acoustic isolation. New residents could hear their neighbors through shared walls, nothing dramatic but enough to know you weren't alone. The privacy that had enabled so much excess was reduced to normal apartment living. The rooftop, once Stokes' farm, became a common area with grills and lounge chairs. Residents held parties up there, enjoying views of the city while standing approximately where chickens had once wandered. The space was still being used for gathering, just sanitized and controlled. The building stood restored, preserved, transformed again. The limestone facade looked better than it had in decades. The lobby gleamed. The apartments offered every modern luxury. By most standards, the Ansonia was saved. But memory works differently than architecture. You can renovate a building, but the stories remain, circulating in books and documentaries and conversations between people who remember when the Ansonia meant something specific, something dangerous, something that can't exist now. The building's final transformation was into monument, not to Stokes's utopian vision, which had failed, not to sexual liberation, which had been complicated and costly, but to the simple truth that buildings outlast intentions, that architecture becomes whatever people need it to be, that preservation is always selective about which histories deserve remembering. The Ansonia stood beautiful and expensive and slightly haunted, exactly as Stokes had imagined, and nothing like he intended. Chapter 12. What utopia becomes today, the Ansonia looks exactly as Stokes imagined, and nothing like the paradise he intended to create. The building rises 17 stories above Broadway and 73rd, its Beaux-Arts limestone facade immaculate. Restored turrets and balconies catch morning light. Ironwork curves elegantly around windows. The architectural details that Stokes specified in 1899 all survived the decades of transformation, preserved through landmark status and careful renovation. The lobby fountain still stands where seals once swam. The marble gleams. The bronze work shines. Water doesn't flow anymore, the fountain serving as sculpture rather than function. But it's beautiful, exactly as Stokes drew it, minus only the living creatures he'd imagined would symbolize nature's innocence. Residents come and go through the same entrance that admitted Caruso and Ziegfeld and Babe Ruth. The doormen are professional, discreet, trained to provide luxury service. The lobby feels elegant and calm, nothing suggesting the chaos that once defined this space. Upstairs, apartments sell for millions. Floor-to-ceiling renovations have created modern luxury inside the historical shell. Kitchens with marble countertops and designer appliances. Bathrooms with heated floors and rainfall showers. Living rooms with 11-foot ceilings and Beaux-Arts molding. The building offers everything wealthy New Yorkers expect from premium real estate. The thick walls are mostly gone, removed during renovation. Modern construction replaced them, meeting code but not exceeding it. You can hear neighbors if they're loud. Nothing like the acoustic isolation that enabled 70 years of secrets. The new Ansonia is conventionally private, which means barely private at all. The pneumatic tube system was demolished entirely. The infrastructure that once let residents communicate secretly now exists only in photographs and architectural records. Modern residents text and email, needing no elaborate mechanical systems to maintain privacy. The rooftop holds no farm, no livestock, no attempt at self-sufficiency. Just common space where residents grill and socialize, enjoying views of a city that Stokes would barely recognize. The Upper West Side gentrified completely. Crime declined. Property values soared. The neighborhood became exactly what Stokes hoped his building would create. Prosperous, stable, respectable. But the respectability came from forces Stokes couldn't have imagined. Economic transformation, aggressive policing, real estate development that pushed out anyone who couldn't afford million-dollar apartments. The Ansonia is surrounded by the kind of neighborhood Stokes wanted, achieved through methods he never considered. The basement where the continental baths operated is now storage and mechanical systems and a fitness center. No trace remains of the tile work, the steam rooms, the dance floor where liberation was tested nightly. The space exists in photographs and oral histories, preserved digitally but erased physically. Visitors who know the building's history sometimes come searching for remnants. They walk through the lobby, ride the elevator, look for evidence of what happened here. Most find nothing. The renovation was thorough, The Ansonia's notorious past exists now primarily as story, not as physical reality. But stories persist differently than architecture. The Ansonia appears in books about LGBT history, about the sexual revolution, about New York's cultural transformations. It's mentioned in documentaries, referenced in academic papers, discussed in walking tours that stop outside to explain what this beautiful building once enabled. The contradiction is perfect. The building looks like a success, preserved and functioning and profitable. But what made it historically significant was erased to achieve that success. The Ansonia stands as both preservation triumph and cultural amnesia. Current residents mostly don't know the detailed history. They know it's a landmark building, that famous people lived here, that the architecture is special. The specifics about bathhouses and swing clubs and decades of scandalous freedom don't appear in the marketing materials or the real estate listings. Occasionally, someone researches the building's past and feels uncomfortable living in a space with such complicated history. Others find it fascinating, appreciating that their apartment exists in a building that meant something beyond shelter. The Ansonia still divides opinion, just about different questions now. Stokes wanted to build a machine for virtuous living. He failed completely at that goal. The Ansonia never enforced morality, never prevented vice, never created the utopian community he imagined. Every design choice intended to protect residents from corruption instead enabled freedom from judgment. But in failing his intended purpose, the building achieved something arguably more important. It became a space where people could test different ways of living, where liberation found accidental sanctuary, where thick walls protected not virtue, but the right to define virtue for yourself. The legacy is complicated. The Ansonia enabled wonderful things: artistic freedom, community formation, lives lived openly despite societal condemnation. It also enabled excess, spread disease through spaces that celebrated intimacy without adequate caution, became synonymous with behavior that many found genuinely harmful. You can't separate these histories. The building that gave Bette Midler her start also hosted activities that accelerated AIDS transmission. The walls that let Caruso practice freely also hid affairs and indiscretions and behavior that hurt people. The Ansonia contained multitudes, not all of them noble. What remains is architecture and memory. The building stands, beautiful and functional and expensive. The stories circulate, preserved imperfectly, argued over by people who remember different versions of what the Ansonia meant. Stokes died believing he'd failed. His utopia had become Babylon, his careful moral geometry corrupted beyond recognition. But perhaps the failure was definitional. Utopias collapse not because humans are corrupt, but because utopian thinking demands we transcend our nature. The perfect society can't exist because perfection requires eliminating the messy, complicated, contradictory reality of human need. The Ansonia's real achievement was accepting that mess, not planning for it, not designing for it, but accommodating it when design failed to prevent it. The building learned to be whatever its residents needed: sanctuary, playground, refuge, stage. It outlasted Stokes' vision by abandoning vision entirely, becoming practical instead of ideological. Today, the lobby fountain sits empty and beautiful. The seals are gone. The farm is gone. The bathhouse is gone. The soundproof walls mostly gone. What remains is limestone and memory, architecture that holds stories, even when the stories contradict the building's original purpose. Visitors stand on Broadway and 73rd, looking up at 17 stories of Beaux Arts elegance. The building reveals nothing. You have to know the history to recognize the significance. And even then, you're left with questions that architecture can't answer. Did the Ansonia fail Stokes's vision? Or did his vision fail to account for what people actually need from paradise? Was the building's transformation corruption or liberation? Did it enable freedom or enable excess? And are those different things? The Ansonia offers no answers. It just stands there, solid and silent, containing multitudes across decades. A monument to the impossibility of controlling human nature through design. Proof that spaces created for one purpose will always be repurposed by human need. Stokes wanted to build walls against vice. He built walls that protected whatever happened inside them. His failure became the building's greatest success. The Ansonia survived by becoming exactly what it needed to be, regardless of what anyone intended. Paradise, it turns out, isn't a place you build. It's a space people create despite architecture, not because of it. The Ansonia learned that lesson slowly, painfully, over a century of transformation. The building stands as that lesson's monument, beautiful, complicated, impossible to judge simply. Exactly like the human nature Stokes thought he could design away, but only managed to house, protect, and inadvertently celebrate for 100 years. The Ansonia endures. That's its final truth. Not as utopia, not as Babylon, but as architecture that outlasted every vision imposed on it. The building won by simply lasting, by being solid enough to survive being wrong about everything, except the fundamental need for walls. And the walls, even restored, still remember everything.